The seamstress kept her head bowed over the gray silk, and the whole ballroom decided she was no one at all. Candlelight ran along the length of the long gallery at Ashmore Court, catching the diamonds at 100 throats, and not one of those 100 throats turned toward the woman kneeling at the hem of Lady Cressida's gown with pins between her lips. She was there to serve the season, nothing more. She fitted the great, and let the great forget she had hands. But the man at the far end of the gallery, the new Earl of Ashmore, had gone very still at the sight of her, the way a man goes, still when a name he has buried speaks itself again in his ear. He did not know her. He was certain he did not know her, and yet his hand had found the edge of his coat pocket, where a folded thing lived, that he had not shown to anyone, and his jaw had set like stone over cold water. What he did not yet understand was that the woman with the pins had once been called something other than seamstress, and that she carried sewn into the boning of a corset she had not worn in 3 years, a paper that would unmake half the certainties in this house. Her name was Eleanor Vane. 3 years before, she had been a gentleman's daughter with a small dowry and a father who read Virgil aloud after supper. Then the father died, and the small dowry proved to be a debt wearing a dowry's clothes, and the house on Chain Row was sold with the Virgil still on the shelves. Eleanor had learned that a needle was the one skill a fallen gentlewoman might sell without selling herself entire. She had learned to be quiet. She had learned that the surest way to survive a room full of people who outranked her was to make herself the furniture they leaned upon and never saw. She was very good at it. That was the trouble. Nobody sees the furniture, and so nobody had ever asked Eleanor Vane where her child was. If you have ever been overlooked in a bright room, if you have ever stood at the edge of other people's warmth and counted yourself lucky merely to be let in the door, then you already know the particular arithmetic Eleanor did each morning. Stay small. Stay useful. Ask for nothing. She would not have said she was unhappy. She would have said she was alive, which was not the same thing. And she knew it was not. And she had made her peace with the difference. Or she thought she had. The Earl crossed the gallery. He did not hurry. Men of his rank never hurried because the room rearranged itself to receive them. And Eleanor felt the room rearranged now, felt the pressure of attention shift the way air shifts before rain. She kept her eyes on the hem. Lady Cressida's mother, the Dowager Countess of Ashmore, watched her son approach the kneeling seamstress with the expression of a woman watching a valuable vase carried too near a stair. "You will forgive the intrusion," the Earl said, and his voice was low and level, the voice of a man who had learned to keep everything out of it. "I am told you are the finest hand in the county." "I am told a great many things about myself, my lord," Eleanor said, "most of them by people who have never watched me work. It was not the answer a servant gives." She heard herself give it, and felt the old danger, the danger of being interesting, which was a luxury she could not afford. But the Earl did not stiffen. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, and had not been used in some time. Julian said the same of himself once. He said, half to himself, and then he seemed to hear his own words, and the almost smile closed like a door. Eleanor's needle stopped. Julian. She had not heard the name aloud in 3 years. Not from any mouth but her own, whispered over a grave that held no one. Her hand did not shake because she had trained it not to, but her heartbeat climbed into her throat and stayed there, loud as a clock. In an empty house, the Earl had already turned away. The Dowager was at his elbow, murmuring something about the impropriety of a peer conversing with the help, and Lady Cressida was complaining that the pin at her waist had gone crooked, and the gallery closed over the moment like water over a dropped stone. Eleanor bent again to the hem, but her whole body had gone to listening, and she could not have said why, except that a dead man's name had walked back into the room on a stranger's tongue. The Earl of Ashmore was named Gideon, and he had not asked to be an earl. The title had come to him 8 months earlier, by the worst road a title can travel, which is the death of a brother. His younger brother, Julian, had been the bright one, the beloved one, the one their mother had forgiven everything. and Julian had gone to sea on a packet bound for Lisbon and had not come home. The ship was lost off Finisterre with all aboard. There had been no body to bury. There had only been a name carved into cold marble in the family chapel, and a mother who had decided in her grief that the sea had robbed her of the son who mattered and left her the one who merely did his duty. Gideon had done his duty. He had done nothing else for 8 months. He had gone through his brother's papers, settled his brother's small debts, endured his mother's grief as though it were weather, and in a locked drawer in Julian's rooms he had found a folded paper he did not understand and had told no one about because it made a claim so impossible that to speak it aloud would be to invite the whole county to call him mad. He carried it in his coat now, over his heart, the way a man carries a wound he has decided not to have looked at. The paper was a marriage line. It bore Julian's name, and beside it a woman's name Gideon had never heard, and the date was 3 years old, and it was signed by a curate in a parish Gideon had never visited. He had assumed at first that it was a jest or a forgery, or the residue of some entanglement his brother had bought his way out of. But the more he looked at it, the less it looked like a lie. And tonight, a seamstress with gray eyes and a still watchful mouth had answered him, as no servant answers, and his brother's name had come out of him unbidden. And she had gone white to the lips and pretended she had not. The next morning came gray and cold, the first hard frost of the season, silvering the lawns of Ashmore Court. Eleanor was up before the house, as she always was, because the great must never see the work that makes them beautiful, only the beauty. She sat in the small, cold sewing room off the servants' passage, and let out the seams of a riding habit, and she told herself the name meant nothing. Julian was a common enough name. Half the county had a Julian in it. She had made a life out of not hoping, and she would not tear that life open because one cold earl had said one common name. Her hands betrayed her, as hands do. Twice she set the needle wrong and had to pick the stitches out. And when the child in the village, the child she paid the laundress to keep, the child whose small, fierce face was the one thing she had refused to give up, when she thought of him she thought also of the paper hidden in her lodging, and for the first time in 3 years she let herself wonder if the paper might be worth more than the danger of it. That afternoon the Dowager Countess summoned her. The Dowager received her in the morning room, a chamber done all in pale green silk with a fire too small for the size of it, so that the cold sat in the corners. The Dowager did not ask her to sit. She looked Eleanor over the way. One prices a horse, one has no intention of buying. You spoke to my son last evening, the Dowager said. You will not do so again. I have had girls in your position mistake a gentleman's courtesy for an opening. It never ends well for the girl. Do you understand me? Perfectly, my lady, Eleanor said. You are a seamstress, the Dowager said, and she said the word the way another woman might say a stain. You are here to make my niece the loveliest creature in 3 counties before her betrothal is announced, and then you are here to be gone. That is the whole of your business in this house, a seamstress, and nothing more. There it was, the label, set down between them like a coin on a counter. Eleanor took it without a flinch, because she had been taking such coins for 3 years, and had learned they only wounded if you let them see they had. I understand my business, my lady, she said, and curtsied and went out. But in the passage, she stopped and pressed her cold hand flat against the colder wall, and she breathed once, deep, the way a swimmer breathes before going under. She had understood her business perfectly for 3 years. She was no longer certain she wished to. The betrothal the Dowager spoke of was the great project of the house. Lady Cressida Marchmont, the Dowager's niece, was to marry the Earl of Ashmore, and the whole season had been arranged around the announcement. It was a match of the correct kind, land beside land, blood beside blood, a match that would knit 2 old families, and settle the grief that had unsettled the house. The Dowager had built it stone by stone. She had chosen Cressida, the way she chose everything, for its rightness, for the way it protected the order she had been born to guard. She did not love her son coldly. She loved him, according to a plan. and the plan had no room in it for gray-eyed seamstresses or dead younger sons who signed papers in country parishes. Gideon knew all this and had let it proceed, because letting things proceed was what he had learned to do. But 3 days after the gallery, he found himself, without quite deciding to, in the stable yard at an hour when the seamstress crossed it to reach the village road. He told himself he wished to ask about Cressida's gown. He asked her nothing about the gown. "You knew the name," he said. Eleanor stood very still. A groom was at the far end of the yard, and beyond the arch the frost still held in the shadows, and her breath showed white on the air. "My lord." "Julian," Gideon said. "I said my brother's name, and you went white as the frost. I have spent 8 months learning to read what people will not say. Do not trouble to lie to me. You are not good at it, which I count in your favor." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. She thought of the child in the village. She thought of the paper. She thought of 3 years of staying small, and she found to her own surprise that she was tired of it. Tired in her bones. Tired the way one is tired, at the end of a very long walk when the house is finally in sight. "I knew a Julian," she said once. "It was a long time ago, and it can be nothing to you." "My lord, he is dead," Gideon said, watching her. "My brother is dead. The sea took him a year past." And there it was. The thing she had not known she was waiting to hear confirmed, and it went through her like cold water. Because she had grieved him already. Had grieved him for a year without knowing whether she had the right. And now a stranger with his brother's gray eyes stood in a frozen yard and made the grief lawful. "I am sorry for it," she said, and meant it so entirely that her voice broke on the small word. And Gideon heard the break, and something in his still face shifted like ice over a river when the thaw first reaches it from underneath. "Come inside," he said. "You are cold." It was a command. She heard the command. She did not yet hear the thing folded inside it, the wish to have her out of the cold, which was the only way this careful man knew how to say he did not like to see her suffer. She did not come inside. She curtsied and went on to the village, and Gideon stood in the yard until the cold reached his own bones, holding the folded paper against his heart, and thinking a name he had not let himself think. In the village, in a laundress's warm back kitchen, a boy of not quite 3 years came running on unsteady legs and buried his face in Eleanor's skirts, and she went down on her knees on the flagstones and gathered him up and held him as though the world outside that kitchen did not exist. His name was Thomas. He had his father's straight dark brows and a laugh that came from somewhere too deep for so small a body. Eleanor had told the world he was the laundress's grandson, an orphan taken in for charity, and the world had believed her because the world does not look closely at laundresses' kitchens. She had kept him hidden not from shame, but from fear, because a fatherless child of no fortune is a thing the world disposes of, and she had sooner die than let him be disposed of. She had married Julian Ashmore in secret in a country parish because his family would never have permitted it. She had loved him, and he had loved her, and he had sworn to come back from Lisbon and make it right to face his mother and his brother and claim his wife and his coming child before the world. He had sewn the proof of their marriage, the line the curate signed, into the boning of her traveling corset himself. Laughing, saying no thief and no mother would ever think to look there, saying, "Keep it safe until I come home and we will burn it, because we will no longer need to hide." Then the sea had taken him, and Eleanor had a child, and a paper, and no husband, and no proof that would be believed over the grief of a countess who did not know she had a grandson. For 3 years she had chosen safety over claim. A hidden child alive was worth more than an acknowledged heir, dead of a scandal. But now the boy was growing, and the money was thin, and the dead man's brother had gray eyes that saw too much, and the paper in the corset had begun to feel less like a danger and more like a debt she owed her son. That night in her cold lodging, Eleanor took the old corset from the bottom of her trunk. The boning was stiff along one side where the extra channel had been sewn. She did not open it. She only held it and thought of a laughing man in a country vestry, and let herself weep for the first time in a very long while, quietly so as not to wake the boy asleep in the truckle bed. What she did not know was that in the great house Gideon had gone to the family chapel and stood a long time before the marble that bore his brother's name and no bones, and had said aloud to the cold stone, "Who was she, Julian? What did you do?" The season pressed on. There were dinners, and a hunt, and the endless small ceremonies by which the great confirm to one another that they are great. Eleanor fitted and pinned and stayed small, and yet the smallness would not hold as it once had, because now the Earl found reasons. He required a button on a coat that had no button loose. He asked her opinion of a fabric as though a seamstress's opinion were a thing a peer might want. Once, when she carried a heavy bolt of muslin across the hall, he took it from her arms without a word and carried it himself, and set it down, and walked away before she could protest, leaving the whole hall to stare. The dowager saw. The dowager began to watch her son the way she had watched the vase near the stair. "You are making yourself conspicuous," the dowager told him. In the library, in a voice pitched to carry no further than the two of them, "The county has begun to remark that the Earl of Ashmore fetches muslin for a sewing woman. Cressida has noticed. Cressida's father has noticed. You will stop. I carried a heavy thing for a person carrying a heavy thing," Gideon said. "I did not know it was a crime against the county." "Do not be a fool," his mother said. And for the first time in 8 months, there was something under the steel of her voice that was almost fear. "You buried your brother. You need not bury the family's name after him. Marry Cressida. Do your duty. Whatever this creature is to you, she is a seamstress and nothing more. And you will remember it." Twice now the label had been spoken, and each time Eleanor had not been in the room to take it, and each time it had been aimed less at her than at the growing crack in the Earl's careful stone. Gideon said nothing to his mother. He went instead that evening to the small, cold sewing room and found Eleanor still at work by a single candle, her eyes red-rimmed and her stitches none the less perfect. And he stood in the doorway and did not come in, because to come in would break something neither of them could mend. "You should not be here, my lord," she said, not looking up. "No," he agreed, "I should not." But he did not go. "My brother," he said instead, "married a woman 3 years ago, in a parish called Nethercombe. I have a paper that says so. I have shown it to no one. I have carried it 8 months and told no living soul, because the moment I speak of it aloud, I set a fire under this house that I cannot put out." He paused. "You went white when I said his name. I think you know the woman he married. I think you know where she is. And I am asking you, not as an earl, but as a man who loved his brother and has no one left to ask, to tell me where she is." Eleanor set down her needle. She looked up at him then fully for the first time, and Gideon saw in her gray and steady eyes something he had been looking for in his brother's papers for 8 months, which was the truth, standing plain in a person and asking nothing. "You are looking at her, my lord," she said. The candle guttered. Neither of them moved. In the silence a log settled in the grate with a soft collapse, and outside the first snow of the year began to fall past the black window, and the whole careful architecture of Ashmore Court held its breath around 2 people in a cold, small room who had just, without meaning to, changed everything. "There is a child," Eleanor said, because now that she had begun, she found she could not stop, and the 3 years of silence came out of her steady and low. "His son, your brother's son. He is not quite 3 years old. His name is Thomas, and he has your brother's brows. And I have hidden him in a laundress's kitchen for the whole of his life, because a fatherless boy of no fortune is a thing your family would have made disappear. Julian sewed the marriage line into my corset before he sailed. He said, 'Keep it safe until I come home.' He did not come home." She stopped. Her hands were folded in her lap and perfectly still. "I have told you the truth, because you asked me as a man, and not as an earl. Now you may do with it what earls do, but I will tell you first that whatever you do to me, you will not touch the boy." I have buried a husband. I will not bury a son to keep your family comfortable." Gideon stood in the doorway and did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was not level. It had stopped being level somewhere in the last minute and had not recovered. "The heir I buried," he said slowly, "lives." "He is not an heir to you," Eleanor said. "He is a boy who likes bread and honey and is frightened of geese. Do not make him a title. Titles get buried. Boys should not have to be." Something happened in Gideon's face that Eleanor had not seen happen in it before. The stone did not merely crack. It came away entire, and what was underneath was grief, and under the grief was a fierce and sudden joy so unguarded that she had to look away from it, because it was too much to watch a man learn in one breath that the brother he had lost had left something of himself behind alive in the world. "Show me," he said, "please. Tomorrow, show me the boy." He did not sleep that night. Nor did she. And in her cold lodging, Eleanor sat by the truckle bed and watched her son breathe and understood that the safety she had guarded for 3 years was over, that she had handed it away with her own 2 hands, and she found she was not sorry, and the not being sorry frightened her more than any earl could. He came to the village at the appointed hour, alone, on foot, which no earl does. And Eleanor met him in the lane and led him to the laundress's kitchen without a word. Thomas was building a tower of wooden spools on the warm flags. He looked up at the tall stranger with his father's straight dark brows and his mother's steady gray eyes, and he did not run away, and he did not smile, but he considered the stranger gravely, as one considers a thing one has not decided about. And Gideon, the Earl of Ashmore, who had carried a folded paper against his heart for 8 months and told no living soul, went down onto his knees on a laundress's kitchen floor in his good coat and held out one spool that had fallen and said, in a voice gone rough, "You have dropped this, I think." Thomas took the spool. He set it on the top of his tower. The tower held, and the boy laughed, that laugh too deep for so small a body. His father's laugh in Gideon made a sound that was not quite a word, and Eleanor stood in the doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth and understood that, whatever came next, this could not now be undone. The dead had left something living in the room, and the living had recognized it, and there is no unseeing such a thing. "He has Julian's laugh," Gideon said when he could speak. "He has a great many things of Julian's," Eleanor said. "The laugh is only the loudest." They walked back toward the village edge in the failing light, and for a while neither spoke, and the snow that had begun the night before still fell soft and steady, muffling the world. It was Gideon who broke the silence, and when he did, his voice had changed again, had gone low and careful, the voice of a man saying a thing he has never said, and is not certain he is permitted to say. "I came to your county to look for a woman my brother married," he said. "I told myself it was duty. I told myself I owed it to him to find her and settle whatever needed settling and be done. That was a lie. I have known it was a lie for some days now. I did not want to settle you and be done. I wanted, God help me, to find that the woman with the gray eyes and the still hands, who answers an earl as though she has never once in her life been afraid of him, was free." He stopped in the lane. The snow fell between them. "I am not a poet. I do not know how to say this the way it ought to be said. But I have carried that paper over my heart for 8 months. And somewhere in these last weeks it stopped being my brother's marriage I was guarding, and became the hope of my own. I want you, Eleanor Vane, not as a duty, not as a thing to be settled. I have watched you carry cold and silence and a hidden child for 3 years without once asking the world to pity you. And I do not think there is a woman in 3 counties I could kneel to more gladly." Eleanor stood very still in the snow. Her heart was loud in her throat again, but it was a different loudness now. And she understood at last what her body had been trying to tell her since the gallery, since the stable yard, since he took the muslin from her arms without a word. She had trained herself for 3 years to want nothing, because wanting was how the overlooked were broken. And here in a snowing lane, a careful man had said her whole name as though it were worth saying, and every trained defense she owned stood useless against it. "You do not know what you are asking," she said, but her voice had no conviction in it, and they both heard that it had none. "I know exactly what I am asking," Gideon said. "I'm asking a countess to walk into a house that called her a seamstress and nothing more, on the arm of the man who was supposed to marry someone else. I am asking you to let the whole county say what it will. I am asking you to trust that I will stand between you and every word of it. I am not asking you to be safe. I am asking you to stop having to be." And he reached out slowly, and did not take her hand, but let his gloved fingers rest a moment against her cold cheek, the barest touch, a question rather than a claim. And Eleanor closed her eyes and leaned the smallest fraction into the warmth of it, and that fraction was the whole of her answer, and he understood it. They did not kiss in the lane. It was not yet the moment for that, and both of them knew it. And the not yet was its own kind of promise, sweeter for being held. He walked her to the kitchen door and bowed to her, as though she were already what he meant to make her, and went back through the snow to the great house that did not yet know its order had already broken. The house was not asleep, however. The dowager had missed her son at dinner, and a groom had seen the earl walk out toward the village on foot, and the dowager countess had not survived 40 years of guarding an order without learning to smell a threat to it on the wind. When Gideon came in, snow-dusted and changed, his mother was waiting in the hall, and her face had gone the particular still white of a woman who has decided to fight. "Where have you been?" she said. It was not a question. "To settle a debt of my brother's," Gideon said, which was true, and not the truth, and his mother heard the gap in it. She did not sleep either. She sent, that very night, a note to the man of business who had served the family for 30 years, and she began, quietly, in the way she did all things, to gather what she would need to make the threat go away. For the dowager had reasoned it out or near enough, a woman in the village. Her son walking out on foot in the snow. She did not know about the child, not yet, and she did not know about the paper. But she knew her son's careful face had cracked, and she knew the shape of the thing that cracks it, and she meant to close the crack before the county could see through it. 3 days later, at the great dinner where Cressida's betrothal was to be announced, the dowager struck. She had done it cleverly. She had learned, through the man of business, through a servant's loose tongue, the shape, if not the whole, of the secret. And she had chosen her moment with a general's care. The long table seated 30. The candles were lit the length of it. Cressida sat in ice blue at the earl's right hand, and the county's best blood filled the chairs between, and at the foot of the table, brought in on a pretext the dowager had arranged, made to stand against the wall like a servant summoned to be dismissed, was Eleanor Vane in her plain gray gown. The dowager rose. She lifted her glass as though to toast the betrothal, and the table hushed, and she smiled the smile that had closed 100 doors on 100 inconvenient people. "Before we drink to my son's happy future," she said, "I find I must clear the air of a small unpleasantness, so that no shadow falls on the announcement. It has come to my attention that a person in my employ has been spreading a tale. A seamstress." She let the word fall the length of the table. "A woman of no family and less fortune, who claims, if you please, some connection to my late son. Grief makes people cruel, and poverty makes them bold, and I will not have my son's memory used by a fortune hunter to climb where she does not belong. She will leave this house tonight, and the county will hear no more of it, and we may drink to the future in a clean room." She turned her cold gaze on Eleanor. "You are a seamstress and nothing more. Say so and go, and I will be merciful in what I do not tell the magistrate about you." The third voicing of the label landed in a room of 30 witnesses, and this time Eleanor was there to take it, and this time she did not take it small. She stood against the wall in her gray gown with the whole bright county turned to look at her, and she felt the old arithmetic rise in her. Stay small, stay safe, say the words she wants, and go. She thought of the boy asleep in the laundress's kitchen. She thought that if she said the words, he would be safe forever in his obscurity, and she would be safe, and nothing would break. And then she thought that a boy who must be hidden to be safe is not safe at all, only buried, and she was done burying. "I am a seamstress," Eleanor said, and her voice was quiet, and it carried the length of the table, because a quiet voice in a silent room carries further than a shout. "That is true. I have earned my bread with a needle for 3 years, and I am not ashamed of it. But I am not spreading a tale, my lady. I married your son Julian in the parish of Nethercombe 3 years ago, before God and a curate, who signed his name to it. I bore his son. The boy is alive, and he is not quite 3 years old, and he has your brows and your temper and your grandson's right to be more than a secret. I did not come to this house to climb. I came to sew a gown. It is you who have made it a public matter, and now that it is public, I find I will not lie to spare you." The table did not breathe. Cressida had gone very pale. The dowager's hand had tightened on the stem of her glass until the knuckles stood white, and for one instant something crossed her face that was not triumph and not certainty, but the beginning of a terrible doubt, the look of a woman whose script has worked in every room she ever entered, and has just for the first time failed to work in this one. "Lies," the dowager said, but her voice had lost its smooth authority. The whole table heard it fray. "There is no proof. There is never any proof with women of this kind. A marriage line. A curate. Convenient tales. Where is your proof, seamstress? Produce it, or be silent." And this was the moment the dowager had counted on, because she believed, as she had always believed, that people of no fortune have no proof, that the poor may claim what they like, and the world need never listen, that a paper in a country parish 3 years old was as good as no paper at all. Then Gideon rose from his place at the head of the table. He did not shout. He did not stride. He reached slowly into the breast of his coat, over his heart, where a folded thing had lived for 8 months, and he drew it out, and he unfolded it, and he laid it flat upon the white cloth in the candlelight where every soul at the table could see the curate's signature and his brother's name. "Here is the proof," he said. The words were level again. He had found his level voice for this, the most important thing he would ever say, and he made it carry without lifting it at all. "I have carried it since I buried Julian. It is my brother's marriage line, signed and witnessed, and I have had it examined by our own man of business, who will tell you it is genuine. This woman is my brother's widow. Her son is my brother's son. And the heir this family buried, year ago, lives and sleeps tonight in a laundress's kitchen in the village, because we frightened his mother into hiding him from us." The room broke into sound, the sound of 30 people all speaking at once, and above it, the dowager stood swaying very slightly, her hand still on the glass. And Gideon crossed the length of the room, past the ice-blue rival, and the shocked county and his own white mother, and came to the foot of the table where Eleanor stood against the wall. And he stopped before her, and in front of every witness who had ever agreed she was nothing, he took her cold hand in both of his, and did not let it go. "You will not leave this house tonight," he said, "except on my arm." That was all. It was fewer than 12 words, and it was the most binding sentence spoken at Ashmore Court in a generation. The county heard it, the rival heard it, the dowager heard it, and something went out of her as she heard it, some long-held certainty about the way the world was ordered. And she sat down slowly in her chair, as though her legs had been taken from her. And she did not speak again that night. Cressida, to the surprise of the room and perhaps of herself, was the first to move. She had been raised, like the dowager, to believe herself the correct choice, and she had believed it without much examining it, the way one believes the sun will rise. But she was not cruel, only certain, and certainty had just been taken from her in a single sentence, and she looked at the seamstress her aunt had summoned to be humiliated, and saw a woman who had just risked everything for the truth, and something in her decided, quietly, not to be her aunt. "If it is true," Cressida said into the noise, and her clear young voice quieted the table, "then she is not a seamstress. She is my cousin's widow, and her son is the heir, and this family owes her an apology, not a dismissal." She rose, and she came down the length of the table, and she made Eleanor a small, precise curtsy. The curtsy one gives an equal, and the county watched a diamond of the first water bend her neck to a woman in gray, and the order the dowager had guarded for 40 years rearranged itself in the space of a breath. It was not a night of triumph. Eleanor had wanted no triumph. When the man of business came the next morning and confirmed the marriage line before witnesses, and the parish register at Nethercombe was sent for and found to bear the same names in the same hand, there was no crowing in it, only the quiet grinding turn of the law settling into its proper shape. The boy Thomas was brought from the laundress's kitchen to the great house, frightened of the tall rooms, comforted only by his mother, and everyone surprised by the grave attention of the Dowager Countess herself, who had asked to hold her grandson, and had not been refused, and who sat a long time by the nursery fire with the child on her knee and her cold certainties in ruins around her, and wept for the son she had lost, and had not known left a son behind. She was not destroyed. Eleanor had not wanted her destroyed. The dowager had been wrong, wholly and publicly wrong, and being wrong in front of the county was punishment enough for a woman who had spent her life being right. In the weeks that followed, she was quieter. She deferred, in small things, to the daughter-in-law she had tried to cast out. Once, finding Eleanor mending a small coat by the nursery fire because old habits do not die, the dowager sat down across from her and said, stiffly, as one unused to the words, "I misjudged you. I misjudged a great many things." And Eleanor, who had learned long ago that mercy costs less than the alternative and buys more, only said, "The boy will want a grandmother who knew his father. You are the only one he has." And that was the whole of their reconciliation. And it was enough. Gideon married Eleanor Vane in the spring, in the same country parish where his brother had married her 3 years before, because she asked for it, and he would have given her a great deal more than that. The curate who had signed the first line signed the banns for the second, and remarked mildly that it was not every day a man saw the same bride wed into the same family twice, and Eleanor laughed, the first free laugh she had laughed in years, and the sound of it was very like her son's. They lived, after, and the way the overlooked learn to live once they are finally seen, which is quietly and completely, with a gratitude that never quite wears off. Thomas grew tall in rooms that no longer frightened him. He was frightened of geese all his life, and of very little else. The corset with the empty channel where a marriage line had once been sewn, Eleanor kept not out of sentiment for the danger of those years, but because Julian's hands had done the sewing, laughing, in a country vestry, and it was one of the few things left in the world that his hands had touched. She kept it in a drawer, and now and then she took it out and held it, the stiff boning along one side, and remembered a laughing man who had told her to keep it safe until he came home. He had not come home. But the thing he sewed to keep her safe had, in the end, kept his son safe, and given his brother a family, and turned a seamstress into a countess in a room full of people who had agreed she was nothing. Julian had sewn a will into a corset and told her to keep it safe. She had kept it safe for 3 years in the dark, and then she had carried it into the light, and the light had not destroyed her after all. On the first snow of the following winter, Eleanor stood at the nursery window with her husband beside her, and her son asleep behind them, and her son's grandmother dozing by the fire. And she watched the flakes come down, soft and steady, over the lawns of a house that had once been arranged so carefully to exclude her. And she thought that the world's verdict on a woman is not the final verdict, that furniture can rise from the corner and be seen, that the buried can prove to be, against all reason, alive. Gideon's hand found hers in the dark by the window. She did not have to train herself to want it. She simply held on. Outside, the snow went on falling, and inside the fire held, and a small coat hung, finished on the nursery chair, mended by hands that no longer had to hide what they could do.